So, welcome everybody to Gothenburg Democracy Talks today. My name is Urban Strandberg. I am the founder and director of the International Youth Think Tank, IYTT in short. There are three organizations who are inviting you here today, and one of them is the IYTT. The other one is the Department of Law at the School of Economics, Business and Law at the University of Gothenburg. And the third inviting organization is Brännpunkt Europa, which is a student-led lunch event organizer who will say a few words about their activities within a bit. So now I will say a few words about the IYTT before introducing today's topic of this lunch seminar. Well, the IYTT is an organization that tries to do something about democracy in the world. Because you know, I think equally well as I do, that democracy is in a big crisis. It doesn't matter what kind of research institute you go to or wherever you find argumentations in different media, there is a democracy crisis in different ways. And the IYTT was founded to do something about it. And we do that by calling upon young persons to help us to make a brighter future. So once a year, the IYTT selects 24 youth fellows. And they are in the age span of 18 to 24. And we call upon them to come to a full week conference with the task of coming up with 12 tangible proposals for democracy renewal. And we have had these selecting of 24 youth fellows now for 5 years. And just to tell you a very interesting number, and that is last year we had applications from 540 individuals from 68 countries. And we selected 24. Anyway, when they have gone through this conference, they have been pretty trained to come up with good arguments for proposals, to present the proposals to an audience, and then we make it possible for them to refine the proposals. So they write working papers and policy briefs that are presented to policymakers. So this part of what the IYTT is doing is to inspire leaders of the contemporary world to renew democracy. And you will see some examples of this, because we have youth fellows in the room today, and you will see some examples of what such a proposal thing could be, how we try to inspire the powerful people of today. The second thing which the IYTT is doing through the youth fellows is to inspire people. Because we think that people need to be more active. They need to look upon themselves as political subjects that could do something about the world, that could claim the right of being a full, legitimized citizen. And the youth fellows are doing this by having conversations with people, 5-minute conversations on democracy. And we have been doing this in more than 50 places on 5 continents since we started that activity. So the IYTT inspire for change, decision makers and people. And this has a broad background. Let's say a few words about today's event. Democracy is a broad thing. There are different aspects of a democratic society to be functional. And today's topic is focused on how we organize society from an economic point of view, how we organize working life. Because, well, working life and economy is a very crucial part for a society, and is the kind of one of the most important, well, backbones for democracy. So today's topic is about the economy and how the working life could and should be organized. The program has basically 3 different parts. The first part will be the main speaker of today that you can see on a picture here on the screen, Roland Paulsen, that I will introduce when it's time to introduce Roland. The second part, you will meet with 2 IYTT youth fellows, Dominic and Anita, who will give comments on the presentation that Roland has been giving you, and who will present to you such proposals as I have been mentioning to you that the IYTT is training our youth fellows to produce. The third part of this seminar today is you, because then is when you have the opportunity to expand the thoughts of us in the room and in the live stream by commenting on what has been said by Roland, Anita, or Dominic, and by posing questions. And we will wrap this up no later than 1:30. So this is the schedule of today. And once again, very, very welcome to you in the room and to you in the live stream. So, Roland Paulsen. Roland Paulsen is a sociologist who is a professor at Lund University, further south in Sweden. And since being a professor typically means writing many research articles and research books, but Roland, and he certainly is doing that quite much, but he's also doing something which is quite not that typical for a university academic. He is very engaged in public debate, generally, very engaged in a very fine way, and he's a daring person, putting out himself in different argumentations as a public intellectual. And I just want to tell the audience the titles of your books before I give you the floor, just to give you a flavor of the breadth of what Roland is doing. So one of the book titles is What If? The New Age of Anxiety. Second one, Empty Labor, Idleness and Workplace Resistance. And the third one, Return to Meaning, a social science with something to say. So there you have a flavor of the breadth, and I think, for me personally, Roland is a person who's bending with our thinking, not only writing to do a good career, he is bending our thinking about society, and that is a pretty good thing. So happy to have you here, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Urban. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's a great honor, actually. I'm looking forward to our discussions. The title for this first lecture is Unlocking Potential, the Promise of Technology in Reducing Work Hours. And I'm curious about what you think of this title, because I often talk about this, and I had to come up with a new English title, so I thought, well, I want to talk about the things I normally talk about, namely how technology increases our collective productivity and thereby presents challenges to work and also new possibilities. And this is eventually what I thought of. It has a bit of a snappy tone to me, almost as if a copywriter at some advertising agency came up with it. So in hindsight, I'm not that proud of it, but is there anything you see here, anything to be suspicious of? No, it's difficult to see, but this was like, yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I should have had both. Yeah, but yeah, well, that's the good thing, actually. This was generated by ChatGPT, so it's not entirely my fault. But yeah, on the other hand, ChatGPT used my instructions. So this will be sort of our starting point. I hope it doesn't reveal too much about my career as a sociologist, but it does actually introduce one topic for today, namely the changing character of work. So there you have it again. And here are a few books I've written. Actually, most of them has been on the topic of work and the changing nature of work. So the first book I wrote up to the left is called Arbetssamhället, the Society of Labor, and its subtitle in English is How Work Survived Technology, which is also the main topic for today. In this book, I try to present the main conflict we have in our economy today, namely an increasing productivity with technological changes on the one hand, and on the other hand, need to put people into employment so that they get an income. So how do we do that when human labor is constantly replaced by new technology? Well, that's the first book I wrote. My PhD thesis called Empty Labor. It's about people not working while at work, and I'll say something about that later on. Then I wrote a book about the Swedish employment agency. Return to meaning is actually how meaning is depleted also in academic work. In academia, we're more and more encouraged to write, as Urban said, journal articles and monographs that aren't very read. And so how do we derive meaning from our work? Eventually, I became a bit tired about writing about work, so the last book I wrote is about worry and anxiety, and it will actually be out soon in English and Korean, if you want to read in that language. My initial interest in this question was not so much with working life studies. It became somewhere else. It was mostly a question of technological advancement. And we're going to have a look at what kind of advancement I'm thinking about. Here are a few numbers for how the number of forestry workers in Finland has changed since the 1950s. And as you can tell, there's been a drastic reduction. We had in 1950 100,000 workers. 35 years later, they were 36,000. And then nowadays, I think the number has even decreased since 2010. They are around 1,500. So this is an enormous decrease in this industry. At the same time, the forestry industry has actually grown in Finland, which means that they are producing more wood than they did before. And the first question that pops up is, of course, why? How is that possible? Well, in the 1950s, you saw a great innovation, that of chainsaws. All of a sudden, you didn't have to have whole teams of forestry workers just to cut down a tree. And that was a great advancement in terms of productivity. Eventually now, we have big trucks who can just cut down trees, get away with all the branches, and do it all in one movement, actually. And of course, you might be worried about the efficiency of this when it comes to sustainability, but in terms of productivity, it is a great advancement. It is actually quite enormous. And this is just one sector in which we see this type of technological advancement. To measure all of these advances in technological productivity, we usually talk about GDP per capita, and this is the GDP per capita in Sweden since 1800. It's been calculated by a few colleagues of mine at Lund University. The numbers are not that unique for Sweden, I believe. I think you'll find pretty much the same numbers in the whole of OECD, but this is specifically for Sweden, and what this tells us, if we only have this measure for productivity, is that since 1900, we've had more than a tenfold increase in productivity in Sweden. And this is in less than 100 years. During my lifetime, productivity has doubled. You can measure this in different ways. You can measure GDP per worked hour, for instance. Then you see an even sharper increase. But regardless, the increase is exponential, which means that it accelerates. It becomes more and more steep. And as I see it, the different advances we've made during modernity are all quite modest in relation to this. Of course, we've had some social progress, democracy, for instance, and things like that. But especially if we look on, say, the later decades, they are quite modest in comparison with this. Spiritual progress, I don't think we've seen much of that at all in relation to this, at least. So to my mind, this is really what modern man has succeeded doing. I mean, if anything, we can pride ourselves when it comes to this development. The strange thing, however, is that in our society, this isn't only something to celebrate. This is also something that creates a lot of problems. And as things are right now, it might create even more problems than it's actually helping us. Back here in the middle of this graph, around 1900, Paul Lafargue, who was actually relative to Karl Marx, wrote that in order to satisfy our most basic needs, due to the technological advancement that they've already seen then, we would only have to work around 3 hours a day. And that was based on his calculations on how far industrialism had developed back then. So since then, we have had a tenfold increase in productivity. We have not introduced a 3 hours working day. We've had a few instances of shortening of the working hours, but not nearly in relation to how much the collective wealth has actually increased. So how is that possible? What happened with this great increase in our overall wealth? This is something I'm going to talk about a bit more. If we look at the changing working hours in Sweden, this is the average annual hours worked per worker. We see that in many nations, the working hours have decreased, not at all in relation to how much more productive nations have become. But there are a few exceptions. Sweden and the US stick out because here and there we actually work a bit more than we did back then, despite having doubled our productivity. So the last time we shortened our working hours in Sweden was in 1976, when we lowered our age of retirement from 67 to 65 years. What we see now in Sweden and elsewhere is something entirely different. For the first time in history, since industrialism, we're doing the reverse. So we are actually expanding our working hours. And we do this by raising the age of retirement. So this is probably something you've heard, that around Europe, and especially in Sweden, we are raising the age of retirement. Elsewhere, there's been a lot of protests against this, especially in France, with the yellow vests and all of that. Was a lot about the working hours. Do you know which nation in EU has the highest age of retirement? No. Well, this is interesting because it's not a hidden fact or anything. I mean, you'll find it in Dagens Nyheter. You find it everywhere. It's been written about. It's actually Sweden, and it was Sweden even before we raised our age of retirement in the beginning of this year. So in Sweden, for those of you who do not live here, we have a fluid age of retirement. So you can start at the age of, I think, 63 now, and you can work until 67. It's probably going to be raised. But when you look at when people actually take their retirement, I mean, when within this span, we have the highest age of retirement in the European Union. And this is quite interesting when you think of France, who had an age of retirement of 63 and wanted to raise it a bit. I mean, think of the reactions there and the complete calm in Sweden when our government decided to raise the age of retirement even more. It's quite interesting. It tells a lot about how within a nation you talk about these issues. So in Sweden, this was all, well, you can ask any Swede about this. I actually encourage you to, if you're here for a while, to ask around, do you know which nation in the European Union has the highest age of retirement? I think many Swedes will not know. But if you ask them, well, was it good that we raised the age of retirement? Almost all of them will say, yeah, well, since we become older and older, of course we have to work more. I mean, this is a great cost, having people living in retirement. Of course, we have to pay for that somehow. This is what people will say. When you look at how life expectancy in Sweden has changed, you see that the steepest curve is actually from the beginning of the 20th century until the middle of it. And this was when when we had most of our cuts in the working hours. So while our average life expectancy grew the most, we also shortened our working hours the most. Right now, as you can say, since, well, say the 60s, we don't see such a sharp increase in life expectancy anymore. We see an increase in life expectancy among men, but among women it's actually quite slow currently. And so how is that possible? How was it that they could raise the age of retirement back then? when life expectancy grew even faster? Well, this is the first key argument I would like to present. In our economic debate today, we are very focused on costs. We talk a lot about costs. The costs of living longer, but also the cost of having people who are unemployed, having people who are ill in different ways, having people who immigrate to Sweden. That's a big one, or at least it was until quite recently. It turned out not to be a great cost at all. But what we don't talk so much about are our incomes, how much our wealth is increasing. And to my mind, that's not a very economic discussion at all. Because of course, if you want to discuss costs, they are only interesting in relation to your income, in relation to what you have. So very few are aware of where we began, how much our wealth is actually increasing. But a lot of us are more than aware, super aware of all the different costs. And there is this nervousness in our society that we don't know how we're supposed to pay for everything. Will we be able to afford health and good schools and all of that? But it's never put in relation to this great increase in our overall wealth. What this leads to is a conflict in our society. When the working hours are constant, as they have been for the last 50 years in Sweden, and we constantly replace human labor with technology, this creates a tension. How do we solve that? Well, we have to create new jobs. That's the only way to allow people to have an income via labor, while at the same time replacing labor. And creating jobs is what all our politicians are sort of competing about. And this is true for Sweden, it's true for almost any nation nowadays. We have to create jobs, not because these jobs are in and of themselves very necessary. When you think of it, if you listen to a politician talking about the necessity for creating jobs, they will rarely tell you which jobs should be created. They will just say, well, we must create new jobs so that people can get an income. And what this means is that work, or wage labor actually, the most important function it has today is to distribute all this wealth that we've created. What purpose it serves, that is what's actually being produced, is quite secondary nowadays. And it tells you a lot about what it means to live in an affluent society. That is a society where the affluence of everything that we're producing has become a problem in itself. It's a problem to the extent that someone needs to consume all this wealth, because otherwise people will have to be sacked from their jobs and so on. And so whenever we have a crisis, the role that our states serve is to stimulate the economy. If capitalism can't take care of itself, we have states that are, on and on, every year almost, go in and stimulate the economy. And also by seeing that all of those who do not work have some kind of income. On the one hand, so that they can survive, but on the other hand, so that they can also stimulate the economy by being consumers. So in that sense, we're not living in capitalism in strict terms. Capitalism would probably not survive for more than a few months on its own, because it can't really adjust to this conflict I just talked about. We live in a so-called state capitalism, where capitalism is constantly saved by the state. So this has been a quite successful story, though you must say, despite having such a great increase in productivity. Our employment numbers are, quite stable. We haven't seen a great crisis like during the 19th century. You could have an unemployment on, say, 50% or so. The state has been quite good at administrating capitalism, but it hasn't really been. It hasn't been 100% success. I was going to say. These are the employment numbers, unemployment numbers in Sweden since the 1970s. And if we were to go back even further, say to the 1950s and 60s, you would see that most of the unemployment numbers back then were around 1 or 2%, which is really low. This is how many of our grandmothers and grandfathers grew up. These were the unemployment they had to deal with. Now, we've had, if you just take since the beginning of the 90s, unemployment has barely been below 6%. It's stable around 8%, which is pretty much where it is today. So what that means is that despite the fact that we're doing everything to push people into work, it's not 100% success. We see how unemployment rates in Sweden and elsewhere are slowly raising. I don't know whether this will continue forever. It's hard to tell. But what this means is that a greater portion of the population lives outside of wage labor. So as I was going to talk about in a bit, we see a precarization of the labor market here. Also in terms of how many work part-time, how many who are employed in the gig economy, and how many who have to live on sick leave. So this is sort of the challenge, or this is how the technological development has actually created more problems than it has helped us lately. Not due to the technological development in itself. It's only because of the fact that we as a society haven't really been able to adjust to this quite remarkable development. So what should we expect in the near future? Well, I already talked about the increasing precarization of the labor market. What we also see in nations where people work the most is a decline of fertility rates. In the last 70 years, we've had a 50% decline in fertility rates, and in some nations, such as Japan and Korea, where people work the most, this is a huge challenge, because what it means is that we have fewer and fewer children who eventually have to support more and more older people, which is another quite frequent argument for actually raising the age of retirement. since we have this imbalance in the population, fewer have to support more people. And I do think that this is a real cost, just as living longer is a real cost, but they are quite small costs in relation to this great increase in productivity that I've already talked so much about. Another thing we're going to see is a rise of the so-called administrative class. So what's the administrative class? Well, first of all, do you know which discipline in Sweden, in higher education, that attracts the most students? Which is our largest discipline, academic discipline? Sorry? Law? No, it's not law. No, not the engineer programmer. No, it's not. But I think you were right in suggesting something that belongs to natural science. However, it's not a natural science discipline either. It's actually business administration. This is all in Sweden, so I will translate it for you. When you look at how many students the different disciplines attract, business administration has been for a long time at the top. And as Urban said, I am a sociologist, so I took my PhD in sociology, but I actually teach in business administration at Lund University. So I've seen this from nearby, and it is interesting when you think of what all these students in business administration are going to do. As I see it, administrating capitalism, seeing that people consume everything that's being produced, and seeing that our organizations are run in different ways, has become a joint effort that swallows more and more workforce. So here we see a rise of an administrative class. A lot of people doing jobs that we earlier didn't seem to require. And it's an interesting phenomenon. And something you can ask here is, what meaning do they derive from this kind of work? When you ask people, this has been done in the US, it's been done in Netherlands, in the UK, and actually also here in Sweden, do you think that your work is helping the world to become a better place? A lot of people will, with great honesty, actually answer no. So in the US, in Netherlands, the percentage was around 40%. That is 40% who themselves say that they are not contributing anything essential in their work. In Sweden, when we did this, it was celebrated as a great result because here only about a third said that they weren't contributing anything while working. And yes, it's relatively good if you compare with these other surveys, but 1/3 not, going to work, not feeling that they are contributing any essential to the world. How does it affect anyone to feel like that? I mean, these are just the brave ones who are open about it, who can, confess that they don't feel that type of meaning. I suppose that there might be others as well who are less open about it. But you often get this sense when you talk with someone about, well, what are you doing? You meet someone during a dinner or a party or whatever, and you ask them, well, yeah, so you're what? A key accountant, desk manager, what? So what do you actually do? Have you tried that sometimes to ask someone? So do you move objects? Do you write? Do you talk? What do you do? And then you get a long explanation, and you find out that you know even less about what people are doing. Well, I think that's because work in itself, drastically changes. When we create new jobs that earlier generations didn't need, we will create a lot of meaningless jobs. Not all of the newly created jobs are meaningless, but you can at least assume that we will have an increasing proportion of meaningless jobs. And this brings me to what I talked about earlier, the theme of my PhD thesis. What I try to argue there is that we see an increasing opacity of the labor process, and what that means is just what I said. It becomes more and more difficult to see what people are actually doing. There are also technological reasons to that. When we have more and more people being educated, they become experts within their own fields, and so it becomes difficult for managers to try to figure out how much time is actually needed for their work tasks. So here we have a problem of management. And what I found out from a survey we did in Finland was that on average, people, at least then, this is 2010, before the smartphones were introduced, people spent around 2 hours a day doing other things than working. And this is the average, There are people working as nurses and doctors and stuff like that. They barely have time to eat lunch, as you are probably aware. But then there are others who have a lot of time to eat lunch and taking fikas and other things we do here in Sweden. And I was interested in how is this possible? Is this some kind of covert resistance, not working while at work, another form of resistance beyond the unions or something like that? But what I found out was that when you ask people, as in this survey, why do you not work while at work? The majority will say, well, I don't have enough work to do. Or they would say my hours are too long, which is pretty much the same answer, or a lack of challenging work. So this was a great surprise to me that so many didn't have enough work tasks to fill out their hours during the day. And we can talk more about why that is and how it's even possible. But I want to end by just mentioning a few alternatives to the recent development we've had when it comes to raising the age of retirement. We see already private initiatives to shortening the working hours. A lot of companies in Sweden and elsewhere are lowering the working hours. It's mostly in companies that attract personnel from, say, the upper middle class, that is in markets where there is a competition about workforce. So in Sweden, we've had this rucksack producer, Sandqvist. They work 6 hours a day. And Malmö municipalities are also on the way to introduce a 6-hour working day. We see a lot of those initiatives. And it's interesting to note that this is how the 8-hour working day was once upon a time introduced. This was not introduced by a state. It was a private capitalist named Robert Owen who introduced an 8-hour working day at his factories in Lancaster. State-imposed shortening of the working hours, well, this might sound repressive, but that's actually the reality we live in. Whenever you talk with someone who are very much opposed to shortening the working hours, they say, well, why should the state regulate that? Well, the state is regulating that in all developed nations we know of. And it's simply for the reason that there is nothing in capitalism that sort of lays a brake on this. It's if we want it to be something, a reform of solidarity that everyone can get something out of, then it will have to be regulated by the state and by law. Otherwise, it will become just like a privilege for the few. And I don't think that shortening the working hours is very much a utopian reform. And I would like to challenge anyone when it comes to this, because how can it be utopian when we've already done it so many times, not only in Sweden, but in all nations practically? When we have an increase in productivity, then this is a quite natural thing to do. When we have a dishwasher in our homes, we don't invent new work in order to replace the one we just got rid of. And so this is the same way we could think about the economy on a macro level. I, for myself, don't think that a 6-hour working day is what we ought to talk about. We ought to talk about a 4-hour working day, and mainly because of reasons that has to do with sustainability. Affluence today is a great, the affluence we create with production is, I would say, the main contributor to global warming. And so we need to produce less somehow. And this could be a great way of doing so, giving people a lot more time, to the extent that it would be quite difficult to foresee the implications for how we would live our lives. The Silicon Valley darling then is, of course, universal basic income, and it's been advocated by Elon Musk now and Barack Obama and a lot of different people. There's a problem when we talk about basic income, namely that people mean very different things. And the main, the main point at which they differ is how high the universal basic income should be. But what it means is basically that anyone should receive an income, either by being an inhabitant of a society or being a citizen. And in Finland, for instance, we had a experiment with universal basic income which lasted for a year, where people could live on they received 600 euros per month, which is a very low basic income. And as I see it, it wouldn't really qualify as a basic income, because this word basic means that the income should somehow cover your basic needs, so that you don't have to work in order to pay your rents, to pay everything you need in order to survive. And this is a bit more utopian, at least because it hasn't really been introduced on a grand scale before. But I think that there are good reasons for discussing this type of more revolutionary reform, because we are at a point where the increases in productivity are so great that sticking to wage labor just as a means for distributing this wealth become more and more obsolescent. It becomes less and less efficient. And so a way of doing away with that might be to introduce a universal basic income. I do not belong to the proponents who think that everything would sort of continue as usual with the basic income. So you hear some people, I don't know who I should mention, but perhaps Guy Standing, who's a very interesting UK economist, saying that, well, people like to produce, people are creative people, and therefore, even if we introduce the basic income, we would still see people doing pretty much the same work as today. I do not think that. I do not think that. I just mentioned that people feel this meaning in wage labor as it is organized today. We would probably see a lot of people working less or giving up their jobs entirely. And so this would have radical implications, and I actually think it would lead us to another form of society than the state capitalism I just talked about. But yes, I think we can talk more about that if you're interested in basic income eventually. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roland. And why don't you take a seat here?
Yeah.
And I will invite to us two youth fellows of the IYTT. So Anita and Dominic, please come and sit with us. Anita and Dominic. So we are now starting off the second part of the seminar today, which means that Anita and Dominic will do some comments on what Roland had been saying. So first of all, to present you, so Anita is the youth fellow of the IYTT since 2022. And you have a degree in economics, studying at Bocconi in Milano and then in Pisa. And Anita is presently doing a traineeship in Frankfurt at the European Central Bank. Good having you here today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Very grateful to the IYTT.
Good to hear. So Dominic Alejandro is from Ecuador, and you joined the IYTT in our last year's conference. And while not being the active youth fellow, you are studying a very special master's program, meaning that you are traveling the world. So you have been to Salamanca in Spain, you have been to Paris in France, and now you are in Stockholm, Sweden, and writing your thesis. So this is the last part of your Erasmus Mundus master's program. So happy to have you here, Dominic.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So we'll first have a first round when Anita and Dominic share some comments on what you have been saying, and you will have to write down if you want to comment on their comments, because you will have the chance further on. And then we have a second round of comments, which is more of a presentation. I will come back to that later. So why don't you start, Anita?
Sure. First of all, I really, really appreciated your presentation, and it was full of insightful, let's say, opinions and observations. So I just took some notes on what's been said, and they're more like comments, and I don't know. I'll be also very curious to hear your opinion, maybe in the commentary later. So first of all, I would like to look at the empty labor, let's say, definition of how people spend some time engaging into private activities during work, right? And I would see that rather than resistance as a form of alienation of the worker when it comes to taking on a job that is more and more meaningless. Meaning that maybe we could see this as a sort of regression to when waged labor was subdivided in very small tasks, and that was conveying the same sort of alienation in work. So how are we going back to that in different forms? And another way in which we could, let's say, try to understand why are we creating jobs that are meaningless, and why are jobs meaningless? Because I agree with you that we are distancing ourselves from an economic form that is more similar to capitalism, but we're going away from this a little bit. And I was just getting acquainted with this new theory from Varoufakis of techno-feudalism. So I don't know if maybe we could see this also with the fact that there are no more profits which are somehow enhancing our economy, but more rents from the big tech overlords, right? So this techno-feudalism idea it states that there's no more triumph of profits, but rather a triumph of rents meaning that flow from the privileged access to fixed things that are given in fixed supply, which in this case is access to cloud data that we're feeding with our own private data to Apple and I don't know, Google, and so that could be also, in your opinion, contributing even more to this undervaluing of meaning. And second, also, given that we have seen that average working hours have not decreased, even if productivity has increased and also where life expectancy has increased, well, why do you think that people feel like they have to work, even though they could be given the chance not to somehow? I mean, could it be because, could it be, and how could it change? How could we change it if people saw meaning in their days, attributing them to wage labor? And how sad is that? And I think I'm done with it. Yes, and just on a last provoking insight, just is it really wealth in the end that we're gaining if we're still working the same number of hours and we're even more alienated? Yes.
Thank you, Anita. Dominic.
Well, first, thank you, Roland, for this talk. I think that my mind kept running when you were talking. So, first, I wanted to comment on your title. For me, promise, when I read it, I instantly thought about advantages, fulfillment, and also disappointment. So I think that was really important for you. So keep it like that, at least for me. But also, when I started to think when you talk, it was about my own experience working. So when I used, and this has happened, when I was working, I was using ChatGPT to help me because it is a tool. And obviously, I could do my job in a less time frame. But I was rewarded with more work. And that was also my point of view, that maybe what about the satisfaction of the workers with these new tools? Also, that was maybe the opposite effect that I started to think, that what about the feelings of the workers with these new technologies, and how these new tools will actually help the workers, or as in my case, obviously I felt that it helped me, but also had the opposite effect. I had more work. And also, when I was started to think, is like, how can I see this in my own country or in my own region? Because maybe we are not as developed as Sweden or other northern countries. So actually, Ecuador, my own country, has the lowest working hours. But in this, I checked according to the whole region, Latin America, according to the OECD. It's around Latin America 48 hours, but Ecuador is 38. So working hours are indeed reduced, but we are still a developing country. Income has not increased, and actually productivity has decreased in 10%. So that was also my observation, because when I started to think about this, is what about the countries that we are still developing, and we are not seeing these reduced hours as a way of producing more, or maybe an outcome in that. So, and also when I started to think about this, is what I've heard also from some people, that at least the comments in my country, in my region, is that maybe we should increase the work hours, because we are not earning enough. Because since we have 8 hours of work, 48 hours per week, and we are gaining $420 per month, which is not enough. So people want to work more because it's not enough. So that was my thought, when maybe you can tell me what do you think about maybe in other context regarding this. And so, yeah, and that part about mentality in itself, because at least from my perspective, when I think about working hours, I'm also thinking about this mentality that you have, and I really appreciate it here in Sweden, that since I've been living here, is the mentality that you have your working hours and then you go home and you have that time for yourself and your family, and that's good. But in maybe my context, the mentality is that you have to keep working, even though that the working hours are 8. You have to keep working because you have to produce more, the sense of producing. But what about family? You are not seeing your family enough. So that was also what I was thinking. And I really like your final remarks about the time waste, what we're thinking that we are doing. So yeah, that was my comments, and maybe you can further develop later.
Thank you, Dominic. So that was the first round of comments, and you will have to come back to commenting on that in a bit, because now we're moving on to the next part of this commenting. And this, I will walk you through a little bit of what you see on the screen to prepare what Anita and Dominic will be saying to you. So in 2022, the conference we had with Anita and 23 others, one of the 12 proposals that were presented by the end of the conference was about well-being economics, a different way of thinking about economics, focusing on the well-being of people. And to do something more thorough about that specific proposal, afterwards, we asked Anita to do a research overview and write up a working paper that you can see the front page up here on the screen. And what that working paper is going through, and in a critical way, going through what GDP as a measure of economic activity really entails, and with a specific view on women's role in society. So that was the first step of doing more thorough background work for a proposal from the conference, published as the working paper. In the next step, and that's what you see in the middle of this of the screen, there are some pie charts coming from the IYTT panel. So we have a panel, and it means it's about 200 young individuals, such that who have applied to the conferences that we organize, but who didn't make it. So they are not our youth fellows, but they are happy to contribute when we occasionally reach out to them and ask them to contribute views when we are producing our proposals. So we had a panel round with 4 different questions that has to do with the thing about valuing unpaid social work. So that was another thing that we were doing after the conference, to reach out to more young persons to see what they think about the valuation of social work, which is done by women. The last thing you see on the slide is the front page of the IYTT policy brief. A policy brief is a typical way of working life if you want to change something. And if you want to reach out to a powerful person, you produce a policy brief, a very pointed proposal of doing something, of changing something. And preferably, it should be referring back to a thorough background, like in this case, the working paper. So that policy brief has been written by a group of youth fellows of the IYTT, and you can see some of the names on this front page. So what will now follow is that Anita will give you the main takeaway from the working paper as she thinks fit of today's topic. And after that, Dominic will give you the main takeaway of the policy brief. So first going to the theory, you could say, and then going to the practical proposal. And this is how the IYTT is working, and that's why it took some time, a little bit lengthy, to walk you through, so that you understand this is how we are working when we are refining policy proposals, trying to change the world. So Anita,
okay,
please.
Thank you. Thank you, Urban. So I will just dive into the gist of what I would like to bring to the discussion today. So first of all, I would like for us to rethink for a minute about the economic system that we've been embedded into, that we're so well used to until this moment. So that's been influencing the way we live, how we will live, and the way we're socialized. So let's try to rethink it. Specifically, what I would like to address and question is the growth paradigm, or better, the growth imperative. Now, what do I mean by growth imperative? Most simply, it is the tendency for capitalist economies to grow. So what is that? So just to accumulate surplus and abundance, to strive for enhanced production with the aim of enhanced consumption. Now I see that a little problematic also when we use growth as a synonym of progress. So while the most developed countries are the ones who have grown more, or who will grow more in the immediate future, or can grow more. And it is a problem also because we're not thinking of the costs of growth. Because growth comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of the invisible, and comes at the cost of the planet and of individuals' well-being. Now, the problematic fact of growth is also how we measure it. Because how do we measure growth? With 3 letters, it's been mentioned before, GDP, so gross domestic product. I'm sure we all know it, but it's most simply output. But what is the most important characteristic of this output that's been produced? It's that it can be translated in monetizable value, so it entails a market exchange. Now, what's the problem with that? It's that it's enhancing a duality between the visible and the invisible, the private and the public. And what is this visible and invisible? Well, within the economic system we are in, there is a productive boundary, which determines the difference between a productive inside and a non-productive outside. Now, the productive inside is what I've mentioned before, so anything that can produce an output which can be translated into economic value, where economic value is a market exchange. Whereas on the non-productive outside is what Rosa Luxemburg defined the 3 white men's colonies, which are the global south, natural resources, and unpaid labor. Now, we'll just spend a quick word on natural resources because I think it's crucial when it comes to talking about growth critique. Because, as I've said before, this strive towards an ever insufficient more comes at the cost of the planet, and we're always more aware of it now with climate change. But instead, unpaid labor. What is unpaid labor? So unpaid labor concerns all those care work activities and reproductive work activities which are conducted in a non-profit-oriented and individual basis, and which we can say are female codified, given that most of care work activities and reproductive work activities are carried out by women, most, if not only in some cases. Now, what do I mean when unpaid labor is not being valued when we talk about GDP accounting? It means that since it's not bringing a value that creates immediately a market exchange, when we talk about GDP per capita growth, percentage increase in it, we're not accounting for this economic value of the market interactions, which are instead enabling the productive inside to happen. So just to make an example and to make it clearer. So now I know I'm talking to a Swedish, mostly I think, audience, so I will phrase my questions differently than how I would phrase them in my native country, which is Italy. So how many of you mothers or your mothers or fathers, I wouldn't say this in Italy, have you seen them like cooking, cleaning the house, doing laundry, taking care of elderly, taking care of children, taking care of neighbors, giving birth? Well, imagine that all that occasions economy is thinking that you are on vacation, that you are having fun, and that is leisure. Well, in my opinion, that is problematic to account for these activities in this way. So I would just leave with, a final note that we want mothers and care workers to be mothers and care workers, ignoring that they're also active in the wage labor market, and we want them to be active in the wage labor market, ignoring that they're also mothers and care workers. So I think it's crucial to think of another indicator which takes into account individuals' well-being, which makes the invisible visible, which cares for natural resources and the planet, because the planet needs it and human beings need it. And I also think that we should embrace the concept of care work not as an individual responsibility, not as women's responsibility or duty, but as a collective endeavor which is beneficial to the society well-being overall. And most of you might be thinking, well then, to make this economically valuable. So to value this care work activities, well, why don't we just put it in somehow, measure it together with the GDP, right? And I will be concluding by quoting Marilyn Waring. When she was asked this, she answered, "I do not want the most valuable things on earth, the things I treasure, sitting in an accounting framework that thinks that war is great for growth." And so now I've conceptualized my issue, and Dominic will provide some proposals. And
Perfect. Thank you so much. So based on the working paper that Anita has presented and the AYTT Youth Panel, this policy brief was born where we seek to revalue unpaid care work socially, politically, and academically. And more importantly, we come up with proposals. So as we have seen, if we talk about care work, we talk about women. And since women bear the brunt of simultaneous unpaid domestic responsibilities and paid employment, this imbalance not only underscores the gender nature of care, but also highlights the need for systemic change. So in this context, it is important to take into account that the impact that changes in demographics have on care work and how women would be involved. In this sense, even though global fertility is falling as the world ages, care work will be seen and felt differently according to the region. In countries that will see drastic population increases, women's caregiving activities will be highly focused on caring children. In context of population decline, however, the burden will be shifted towards supporting the elderly, as Southern Korea. And this policy brief also recognizes that the importance of avoiding a clunky one-size-fits-all mentality. Keeping this in mind, the policy brief presents 6 proposals: invest, unionize, pay, regulate, improve, and educate. What do we mean about invest? Well, we talk about investment in social services, primarily family services, to erode the expectation that women must take on the duty of care. Second, unionize. National trade unions should be set up to bring visibility, structure recognition, and a voice to unpaid and underpaid care workers. Therefore, the unions must be bottom-up, democratically organized, and member-led to give more representation. And the third one, and is quite intuitive about payment, unpaid workers must be fairly compensated. So, and regulate means, as the name says, regulation on working conditions must be introduced to create norms that improve the working conditions of currently unpaid care work. And fifth, when we mention improve, it is related to the expansion of both paternal and maternal leave. And this is a fact. 63% of countries provide paternal and maternal leave. What about the rest, I say? Finally, educate. Informing and educating citizens from a young age, both within and outside the school, would help address the undervaluation of care work and gender inequalities. So, in conclusion, as we contemplate the multiple challenges, changes, reforms that working hours can bring out, we cannot overlook the fact that care work is essential for people's well-being. Care work is not just work. It is the very essence about how and who humans are. And yet, in our current economic model, fails to recognize that and remunerate this fairly. So thank you so much for listening to this.
So, walking on to the third and last phase of this seminar, we have an open question and a commenting session for you in the room, and for you who are in the YouTube live stream. If you have something to say, send an email to the email address that you can see on the screen now. And we will have a great help with the microphone by Lisa Lundgren, who also happens to be an IYTT Youth Fellow since 2020. So she will give you the microphone when you want to say something. Who want to start this Q&A? Yes, here we have one. And please state your name so that we know who you are.
Hello, my name is Eugenia. I'm studying European Studies at Gothenburg University, and my question is for you, Roland. Are there do conversations around the age of retirement and its benefits of increasing or decreasing include self-employed individuals, since they also work, but from my personal experience, a lot of my family members are self-employed, they have their own businesses, they end up working until they're 80 because they don't have, they have a state pension, but that's not enough for them to live on, so they continue working so that they have an additional income to maintain their standard of living and then support their family, etc. Is that a conversation that is around in Sweden, or what? Do you have any thoughts about that or insights?
Yeah, well, I think that relates to what you said about Ecuador having to work after your working hours are finished. And that is that in some respect, how we talk about working hours is increasingly remote from reality. So you can continue working after you've finished your job. You can have two jobs, even in Sweden. There's no regulation against that. It's just when it comes to a single job. And so if wages are too low, you can force people to work even more, regardless of how the regulation of time is organized. And here there's a quite big inequality, not only in terms of who's employed, self-employed or who has a wage labor, but also what type of wage labor you might have. So what we've seen since the pandemic is a huge increase in remote work. And what that means is, well, first of all, that you don't have to spend, I think the average is 1 hour a day to and back from your workplace, but also, of course, that you can modulate, you can work with how intense you have to work while being at home. Some people probably work even more from home, but at least when you're at home, you don't have to pretend that you're working, which is a lot of what people do actually at offices. I talked about empty labor, not having to work while at work. You still have to pretend that you work, which can be even more demanding than actually doing the work. And so what we're seeing is that when we say in Sweden we have an 8-hour working day, it's actually that this 8-hour working day is very symbolic. We have a lot of people like the self-employed and others who work even more, and then we also have a few who formally are employed full-time 8-hour a day, but actually work a lot less. So here there's a great deal of inequality, and when you go into the labor market and think, well, should I take this job or not? If you've been if you've been in your job for a while, you will know at this workplace I'm going to have to work a lot, while at this workplace I can take it more easy. So this is quite internalized. We all know about it, but we rarely talk about it publicly.
Another question up here. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. I had a question about, with regards to everything that you said, Roland, the question of increased wages, and especially for working class people who work with, that clean our streets, that teach our children, that sell us food in the grocery store, how that aspect fits into all of the things you said, and especially with regards to basic income, that even if you have this, we still need people who clean our streets, teach our children and all this, and how do we allow them to have a dignified life? And then we've also had sort of stagnating wages, I think, broadly in the West since the 1970s. And now, de facto, I would say decreased with inflation and cost of living crisis. So if you could say a few words about the necessity of increased wages.
Yeah, well, I think especially in unions, we should talk much more about how much do you actually need? And this is a sensitive issue in Sweden, because it's the most natural thing that you should earn more and more during your lifetime. But, to my mind at least, it is quite relevant to us. If you live in Sweden, do you need to earn more than 50,000 kronor a month? I mean, that's quite a lot. You can do a lot with that kind of money. And we have many who earn much, much, much more than that. And so at least among unions, you could say, well, actually, this is wages you see even among industrial workers. You could say, we're not going to increase your wages anymore because we need to put all those money on these working groups instead, the ones you mentioned. I agree that there are many there who should earn a lot more. In a society in which we would have a basic income, this would be one of the most important implications, I think, because it would constitute a tremendous challenge to attract people to work, which is nowadays only done because you're economically forced to work. I think most, say, cleaners today or others who are not doing jobs that require a lot of education do it just because they are forced to. So why would anyone do it if they weren't forced to? Well, I think that those jobs are exactly the ones that would have to have the highest wages, and their working conditions would have to improve the most. And in order for that to work, we would have to lower a lot of wages, and probably wages among those who are today earning the most, because among them you'll find people like myself working in academia who would do the same thing even if they weren't paid. And this is not a very popular argument among my colleagues, because what it means is that a lot of university professors, they wouldn't earn anything at all. They would have to live on their basic income, and they would have cleaners around them who would earn 4 times as much. So this is another form of society, and it's when you talk about it, people say, well, that's unreasonable. That's those implications are just completely unrealistic. No, that's the whole point, I would say. That would be a much more fair society.
Hi, my name is Isaac, and I have a question for you, Roland. So in regards to, and I appreciate that this is a sort of political question, or that there is an aspect of it to it, but towards the end of your presentation or your talk, you mentioned solutions to, the problems that are posed. And when discussing like the introduction of the 4-hour workday, I was wondering, and you sort of did answer this already when talking now, but who are we supposed to take that money from? Because either we cut the profits from the companies, who then have to, I'm assuming, pay the same amount of money to people who work half as much. But now you did say that we could reduce the amount of money people are paid. But I'm also wondering how that is supposed to work in conjunction sort of with the problems that are posed today, like as groceries and other wares are more expensive now than they have ever been. And I know that economically people are struggling more now than they have before. So I'm wondering, how, when discussing these ideas, how does the discourse go? Sort of how is this supposed to be put into action without people really struggling economically? Or is it a matter of just taking more money from the rich or taxing the rich more? or less profits for the companies? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, well, it's a good question, and I think there's a lot of confusion exactly there, especially when it comes to basic income, and also those sort of drastic reductions of the working hours, because if we're, like now, mainly taxing wage labor, that's the main way we redistribute wealth. So if we decrease wage labor, so where will all the wealth come from? That is a real challenge, and it will have to be accompanied by different forms of taxes. So the whole revenue of a company could be taxed just as well as the human labor. In Sweden, we have a few really, big companies, global capitalist companies like Spotify and Klarna perhaps, and they are actually hiring very few people. I mean, just a hospital in Stockholm hires many, many more, and still they have revenues, really big amounts of money. So why is that? Well, it's a great example of how you can earn money not only on human labor but on technologies. They have, all the people who used to sell CDs and stuff. Spotify have replaced them with technology that they have not developed, by the way. That technology was already in place. And so the question we have to ask is, when a company develops a machine to replace 100 employees, should that tax money, we still have the same production, just disappear? I don't think so. I think we should tax also dead labor, to use Marx's terms, that is production that's generated mostly by technology. And so together with the kind of redistribution I just mentioned, that's where we have to rethink.
Thank you. We have one question from the live stream, so please.
Yes, it's from Therese Karlberg. Okay. As someone on sick leave, you see the world with different eyes. You are chased by authorities who think you should work even though you can't. You are also chased by the public with all the questions about when to start work. You're excluded from society, and all opportunities are mostly for those who work and are healthy. What value does man have? The way I see it, it seems our value lies in whether we can work or not. Shouldn't we talk more about human dignity?
That was a fine comment. kind of ending comment, because we have only 1 minute to go. Thank you, Otto, for keeping track on people in the live stream. So, Roland, thank you so much, and Anita and Dominic, thank you so much. And to give you something to bring with you from here, you will have two things actually. First of all, you will have a copy of this pamphlet. That is the IYTT Handbook for Innovative Democracy. So every proposal that comes from us, you would find in this handbook, and this is the new edition. It's only 2 weeks since it came from the printer. And then when you leave the room, there are copies by the door. So you have one copy each of the handbook, first of all. Another one. However, there is a more thicker thing that you as speakers are having too. This is a newly printed book. The title is Towards a Sustainable World, Academic Insights and Perspectives. And it is an edited anthology written by different scholars at the School of Business, Economics and Law, which is just across the street. And I happen to be one of them. Anyway, so different chapters reflecting upon what it takes to have a sustainable world. Today we have discussed what a sustainable world would mean economically and work-life-wise. There are more sustainable aspects that you, in all likelihood, are interested in. So please have this copy with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, you can see some words. Thank you for the sponsors of today. And I forgot, clumsy me, to ask Lisa to say a few words about Brännpunkt Europa, who actually treated you to the sandwiches and coffee. So, Lisa, why don't you say a few words about your organization before we end all of this?
Thank you. I'll be really quick since you might want to get out of here. But I'm Lisa, I'm co-chair of Brännpunkt Europa. I just want to say thank you so much for coming today. It's been a true pleasure to organize these Gothenburg Democracy Talks together with the IYTT. I hope we can collaborate more on stuff like this in the future. And before you leave, you can also see here our social medias, and you can scan the QR code to stay posted on our upcoming events. We have one more event this semester, so please come to that. You can read more about it on our social medias soon. And I think that's all. Thank you for coming today.
So thank you, everybody. And if you want to be knowing more about the IYTT, just go into the webpage and learn more about us. Thank you.